So I have 8 minutes to convince you that it is very interesting to have an idea of the sagittal balance, but not only in standing position. You have here different examples of mechanical and viscoelastic implant, mechanical on the left, viscoelastic on the right. And you see we used to sitting X-rays for lumbar spine. Until now, we see a lot of patients, mainly with CT scan or RMI, as a main tools to decide about a disc replacement. I am not convinced it is a good thing because we need to have a local, a segmental analysis of the implant, but also a global analysis of the implant. During the last webinar, we have developed the concept of the range of motion, sagittal rotation and translation. And also we have spoken about the location of the mean center of rotation, as you see on the left animation with the arrow. Alexis did a very good paper showing that regarding the lumbar spine, there is no significant changes between post-op and pre-op alignment. It is very interesting because the message is with a disc replacement, we cannot do a palliative of sagittal malalignment. But there is another aspect. It is also, in a way, a predictive tool to do preoperative X-ray, a predictive tool to understand how the prosthesis will work after implantation. We have here some example of full body EOS. I have the opportunity to have a lot of EOS images, so it's very interesting to demonstrate this. You have patients with different pelvic incidence, and in yellow, we are accustomed to look at the sacral slope, and you see before pre-op and post-op, no significant change. But I want to convince you that the balance analysis is a dynamic concept. Case 1, case 2, and case 3 are very different, and we know this from the hip surgeon, in a way, because we know that during sitting position, we have a retroversion, ideal retroversion case 1, case 2, patient with a stiff retroverted pelvis, and the right case is also very interesting because some of our patients with disc problem have hyperlordotic deformity. So what is interesting is to detect the case 2 and the case 3 because we know that case 1, it works very well. So what about the sitting position? We know that the sacral slope decreases when sitting. We also know that the angulation of the disc changes. How to see this very quickly on the images? You see the convergence of the red line showing the end plates of the prosthesis, and you see that when the prosthesis becomes flat, the convergent point is very posterior. Not in all cases you will see, but this is a case of a standard viscoelastic implant. So some of our patients have a normal kinematic of the implant, but they are very different. On the left side, you have a patient, you can call him a spine user. You see, with sitting position, he has no complete hip flexion. On the right, this patient has 2 hip replacements. She has a mechanical implant, and you see that she is a hip user, using a lot hip to sit. So there is a balance between the mobility of the hip and the mobility of the spine. So you can say to me, okay, in theory, and nothing changed standing. What about sitting? Sitting position, the same. When you ask a patient to sit after a disc replacement, in most of cases, there is no significant change of sacral slope. I have no time to show you a lot of data, but you can trust on me. It's true. Like in this case, for example, you can say to me, between pre-op and post-op, changes of sacral slope are not very different. But look at the hip. And so I think spine surgeon must look at the hip. And you see that after the prosthesis, this patient used less his hips than before, probably because he is less painful. So we have different type we know that standing and sitting, no standard modification between pre-op and post-op. But our patients are very different. Look at the case on the left. This patient has a huge modification of the global lordosis between standing and sitting after his hip prosthesis. On the right, you see no important delordosis. So it means that the modification of the angulation of the disc is not so important. What does it mean? It means that you have less constraint. You are not asking as much to your implant. So it is interesting to look at those patients with a huge modification of the retroversion, huge modification of the curvature. Perhaps type 4, as Alexis said to us before. So what happened? You have here a standard patient, 50 degrees pelvic incidence. This image is taken from the morphing of EOS, and you see between standing and sitting, you have a decrease of the angulation. It is a viscoelastic implant, and you see the modification of sacral slope. Now we look at a low pelvic incidence patient. As spine surgeon, we know that the pelvic retroversion is more important in standing position, so the sacral slope is less. And in sitting position, sacral slope is also less than with standard pelvic incidence and even negative. Now we look at the same standard pelvic incidence patient. You see the variation of sacral slope, very typical. And now you see a high pelvic incidence patient, and you see there is a much more important modification of sacral slope. So probably more, we are demanding more to the implant. Look at those two cases. On the left, you have a mechanical implant with a low pelvic incidence. What is surprising to you is to see where is the convergence point of the end plate. Very often people say, I use a mechanical prosthesis, and by the way, it will adapt itself. You can see in this case, because this patient has an atypical adaptation due to low pelvic incidence, the angulation of the prosthesis is modified in the wrong way, in a way. On the right, you have a patient with high pelvic incidence, huge modification of the global balance, and you see you are demanding much more to the viscoelastic implant. So we have the functional aspect of standing to sitting, but we have also probably structural problem due to the pelvic incidence. Now moving quickly to the cervical spine. I think something very important for us coming from the images is the T1 slope, as Alexis said to us. And there is another parameter, because you have patient with low T1 slope and patient with high T1 slope. And we have also, but we are accustomed to this as spine surgeon, we look at the C2, C7 sagittal angle. It's not theory, because this is a case pre-op. You see that this patient has a high T1 sacral slope. So we need to have preoperatively such X-ray, not only doing basic dynamic X-ray, we need to look at the T1 sacral slope. And you see here how different is the position of the implant between high flexion and high extension. And this raises the idea of the extension reserve and the flexion reserve. Not all of the patients are the same for extension reserve and flexion reserve. Look at this patient, for example. It is a mechanical implant. You can see the adaptation of this implant. It works very well. This patient is not painful, but this alignment is a little bit problematic. And look at the center of rotation with this black arrow. You see the center of rotation is not correct because it is inside of the prosthesis. So probably problems to come by the time. Another case with high pelvic, high T1 slope, and you see the same risk with center of rotation inside of the implant. Now, low T1 slope, I want to convince you to look at this T1 slope. You have lower level of kinematic stresses on the implant, you see, because you have less extension reserve regarding the standard position of the patient. Here, another case, pre-op, post-op, you see, you have less extension ability. So probably you cannot promise to the patient full range of motion. Look at this patient, for example, you see this strange adaptation. We cannot believe using loose implant, a mechanical implant, to provide a self-correct adaptation in all cases. Look at this case with a viscoelastic implant, the same problem. We are facing the same problem, less extension ability, but with the advantage of no fixed center of rotation. So the center of rotation can move outside of the prosthesis. Now, quickly to finish, cases with 2 levels. As a demonstration, I only use cases with 1 level. You have here a patient with high T1 slope, and you see the location of the center of rotation. And not all is pink, because you see that when we have 2 levels of implant, sometimes there is no perfect center of rotation, but you see the center of rotation is different for extension and flexion. And here, cases with low T1 slope, and you see the center of rotation, we must look at this. We shall have now the tools to analyze this center of rotation. So what are my UMIL message? First, it is important not only to use CT scan or RMI. The problem is not to replace deteriorated disc. We must analyze the sagittal balance as a dynamic concept. Despite there are few variations between post-op and pre-op. The fact that there are few variations is a good predictive information regarding the future of the prosthesis. At the lumbar spine, you don't need EOS. You need only sitting and standing lateral X-ray, and you need to look at the pelvic incidence. Be aware of the high pelvic incidence patient, but also to the low pelvic incidence patient. Remember my 2 cases. And cervical spine, no EOS. You need to do flexion extension X-ray. You need to look at the T1 slope. You need to detect if the patient has a flat cervical spine. What is preoperatively the extension ability. Knowing this, you know better the risk of slipping or excessive translation. Thank you for your kind attention.